This is Death at the Bosphorus, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Welcome back to the Little Grey Cells. I'm Arthur Hastings, and thank you for joining me tonight on this journey into the heart of darkness. First, we would like to greatly thank our listeners from all over the world. If you're joining us for the first time, we invite you to subscribe and write a comment where you are from. Dim your lights, Poirot yourself a tisane, and prepare to exercise your own grey cells. Chapter 1. The Place That Remembers. "This house," said Hercule Poirot, standing in the doorway of his appointed bedchamber and regarding the damp-stained ceiling with an expression of profound displeasure, "has character. Unfortunately, it has rather too much of it." His valet, Georges, said nothing. In the 18 years of his service to Monsieur Poirot, Georges had developed an admirable faculty for silence at precisely those moments when silence was the wisest possible contribution to the conversation. Kara Yali, the Black Mansion as it was known to every fisherman and ferry passenger who navigated the northern reaches of the Bosphorus Strait, stood at the edge of the water like an elderly gentleman who had leaned too long over a balcony railing and was no longer entirely certain of his own balance. It was an Ottoman waterside estate of considerable antiquity and considerable decay. Its cedar beams darkened by 2 centuries of salt air, its shutters warped by winds that came across the Black Sea with nothing to slow them. Beneath its foundations, if one believed the local historians, lay the broken stones of a Byzantine watchtower that had once guided fleets through the strait with signal fires. Poirot did not believe in Byzantine watchtowers. He believed in order, method, and the correct preparation of tisane. None of these 3 things was readily available at Kara Yali. He had arrived that afternoon as the guest of Selim Demir, the mansion's current owner. A charming, somewhat distracted antiquities dealer of middle age who collected crumbling things with the enthusiasm of a man who did not have to repair them. Selim had met Poirot's boat at the private landing stage wearing a linen suit of excellent cut and an expression of genuine pleasure. "My dear Poirot, you have come at the perfect moment. The roses along the waterfront wall are in flower. The light on the strait at this hour is incomparable, and, most importantly, I find myself in need of your very particular kind of company." Poirot had smiled politely and noted several things simultaneously. That the roses Selim gestured toward were in fact badly overgrown and strangling the wall's ancient mortar. That the incomparable light was largely obscured by a fog rolling in from the direction of the Black Sea with some determination, and that the phrase, "your very particular kind of company," was the sort of thing people said when they wanted something from Hercule Poirot that they were not yet ready to name directly. He had filed this observation carefully in the little grey cells and said nothing of it. There would be time. The other residents of Kara Yali had assembled for apéritifs in the drawing-room, where Selim introduced them with the proprietorial pride of a man displaying an unusual collection. Poirot observed each one with the quiet attention that those who did not know him frequently mistook for social amiability. Nadia Petrovna was a Russian widow of perhaps 50, dressed in too many layers of dark fabric for the warmth of the evening. She had handsome bones and frightened eyes, and she pressed her sherry glass between both palms, as though warming herself at it. "Monsieur Poirot," she said when introduced, "you must tell me that you do not believe in ghosts." It was not a question. "I believe in the evidence of the little grey cells, madame," Poirot replied, "which is, I assure you, a very great deal more reliable." She looked at him with the expression of a woman who had hoped for more. Dr. Kamal Arslan occupied the largest armchair with the ease of a man accustomed to claiming territory by sheer force of intellectual presence. He was a historian of middle years, trim and sharp-featured, with a pair of spectacles that he wore pushed up on his forehead rather than before his eyes, as though his vision were so superior to the objects around him that correction was an insult to both parties. He was, Selim explained, cataloguing the mansion's collection of Ottoman documents and curiosities. "Extraordinary archive," said Dr. Arslan, not looking up from his notes. "The ghost stories are, of course, absolute peasant theatre." Nadia's sherry glass rattled against her rings. Arda Karaka was the last to be introduced, and he came forward with the easy warmth of a man to whom charm was less a quality than a reflex. He was younger than the others, perhaps 35, with dark, intelligent eyes and a smile that arrived quickly and departed slowly. He was Selim's business associate, apparently, involved in the acquisition of certain pieces for the collection. "But tonight," he said, spreading his hands with theatrical pleasure, "we are not businessmen. Tonight, Monsieur Poirot, you must allow me to tell you the story of the Bride of the Bosphorus. It is the real reason everyone comes to Kara Yali." "And does everyone enjoy it equally?" Poirot inquired. Arda laughed. It was an excellent laugh, warm, unreserved, and very slightly too well-timed. Selim's son, Levant, sat apart from the group near the window that overlooked the tower. He was a quiet young man of perhaps 25, with his father's good looks and something else besides. A watchful stillness that Poirot recognized as the quality of a person who has learned to observe without being observed in return. He said very little during the introductions. His eyes moved occasionally toward the tower window with the unconscious regularity of a habit long established. Fatma, the housekeeper, served the aperitifs with the focused silence of a woman who had long ago decided that the inhabitants of this particular house were best managed rather than engaged. She was stout, grey-haired, and moved through the room with the purposeful economy of someone who knew exactly which floorboards creaked and avoided them by instinct. Over dinner, Arda told the story. 2 centuries ago, a young woman named Leyla Halide had climbed the watchtower with a lantern to signal her lover, a sailor who carried messages through the strait by night. Her father had discovered the arrangement. Before dawn, Leyla Halide was found at the foot of the tower rocks, her neck broken. "Some say she jumped," said Arda, with the practiced cadence of a man who had told this particular story many times before. "Others say she was helped." He paused, and in the pause the wind moved through the warped shutters with what Poirot considered an unfortunately convenient timing. Since that night, they say, a woman in white appears on the tower balcony before every tragedy that visits this house. And the tower bell rings. He smiled. Though, of course, there is no bell. "There never was a bell," said Dr. Arslan from behind his wineglass. The tower served as a signal station. The legend is an accretion of peasant anxiety and romantic invention, assembled over decades by people with insufficient occupation. Nadia set down her fork. "I have seen her," she said very quietly. The table fell silent. 3 nights ago, standing on the balcony, in white. She looked at Arda and then at Selim, and then at no one in particular. And I heard the bell. Poirot said nothing. He was looking at Levant, who had not looked up from his plate, and who was, for a young man hearing his family's resident ghost story, apparently retold for the 100th time, very carefully and very deliberately not reacting at all. After dinner, Poirot walked the upper corridor alone. He was not, in principle, a man who gave credence to drafts, creaking timbers, or the atmospheric properties of ancient houses. He was, however, a man who gave credence to everything his senses reported to him and filed it for later examination. The corridor was cold, not the ordinary cold of an unheated passageway in an old stone building. Something different. A coldness with direction to it, a coldness that moved. He paused. Above him, from somewhere in the body of the old Byzantine stones that underpinned the tower staircase, there came a sound. One note only. Low, resonant, fading. A bell tone. Poirot stood very still for a moment. Then he straightened his cuffs, both of them, with precision, and continued down the corridor. The supernatural, he murmured to himself, is very often a matter of poor architectural acoustics. But his pace, had anyone been watching, was very slightly quicker than before. And his eyes, as he passed the door to the tower staircase, moved sideways with an attention that had nothing whatsoever to do with disbelief. In the morning, he decided, he would look at the staircase very carefully. In the morning, there was considerably less time for that than he had anticipated. Chapter 2. The Believers and the Skeptics. The Bosphorus at dawn was, Poirot was prepared to admit, a remarkable thing. He stood at his bedroom window. Having slept badly on account of the listing mattress and the foghorns, which the Strait's shipping traffic employed with what seemed to him a wholly unnecessary enthusiasm, and watched the early light move across the water in long horizontal bands of copper and grey. A tanker was making its way southward, very slowly, as though the current itself were reluctant to let it pass. The opposite shore, Asia, by the simple geographical fact of being on the other side, lay pale and indistinct behind the retreating fog. It was, he reflected, a landscape designed to make one feel the precariousness of one's position. Europe behind, Asia before. And between them, a current that ran in two directions at once. He had slept badly for other reasons besides the mattress. That bell tone, low, singular, absorbed quickly into the silence of the corridor, had returned to him several times in the small hours. Not with any supernatural insistence, merely as a fact requiring classification. Poirot did not enjoy unclassified facts. They lodged in the grey cells like splinters, quiet and irritating, until they were removed or accounted for. He dressed with his customary precision, the suit brushed, the cravat aligned, the moustache attended to with the small ivory-handled comb that had accompanied him since Brussels. Order was not vanity. Order was method. And method, in a house that appeared to tilt gently in three directions and smelled comprehensively of sea damp, was the only reliable foundation available. He found the tower staircase before breakfast. It occupied a narrow passage at the eastern end of the mansion's upper floor, accessible through an arched doorway that someone, Fatma presumably, acting on principles older than her employment, had seen fit to hang with a string of blue glass beads, the kind that ward off the evil eye. Poirot regarded them for a moment, then ducked beneath them with care for his hat. The staircase wound upward in tight stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use. The air inside was cold in the particular way of spaces that received no direct sunlight and very little human warmth. The walls were original Byzantine stonework at the base, darker, more irregular than the Ottoman construction above, and Poirot ran his gloved fingertips along the jointure between the two phases of building as he climbed. What he was looking for, he was not yet entirely certain. What he found gave him considerable pause. Along the inner wall of the staircase, at approximately shoulder height, someone had recently swept a narrow strip of floor. The surrounding steps were filmed with the fine grey dust of weeks. Undisturbed, uniform. The honest accumulation of a space that no one had troubled. But this strip, 18 inches wide and running from the base of the stairs to a point roughly 2/3 of the way up, had been cleared with a brush. Not cleaned, merely prepared. The dust displaced to either side in shallow ridges like snow parted by a careful hand. Poirot crouched and examined it for some time without touching anything. Then he descended, ducked beneath the blue beads, and went to find his coffee. The breakfast room was occupied by Ada Caracca, who was reading a newspaper with the comfortable ease of a man who has nowhere pressing to be. He looked up when Poirot entered and smiled his arriving and departing smile. "You are an early riser, Monsieur Poirot." "Habit," said Poirot pleasantly. "And you?" "The light on the water," Ada said with a gesture towards the window. "I find I cannot sleep through it. It is a condition of staying at Yali, I think. The house does not encourage rest." He said it lightly, as a man says a thing he has said before and found effective. Then, folding his newspaper, "Did you hear it again last night? The bell?" "I heard a sound," Poirot said, accepting coffee from a silent maid who appeared and withdrew with considerable efficiency. "Whether it was a bell is another matter." Arda tilted his head with the pleasant curiosity of a man who finds skepticism charming rather than threatening. "You are careful with your words." "I am careful with most things," said Poirot. "It is a lifelong practice. Tell me, this legend of the Bride of the Bosphorus. You tell it with great fluency. Have you been a guest here long?" 3 months, said Ada. "Selim and I have business that requires time. The archive is extensive." A pause, perfectly calibrated. "And the story. One hears it from the servants very quickly. Fatma alone has 17 variations. I simply collected them." "You collected them," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, you have the instinct of the collector." If Ada detected anything beneath this observation, his face gave no evidence of it. He returned serenely to his newspaper. Dr. Arslan arrived at the breakfast table 20 minutes later, in a state of organized impatience, carrying a leather document case that he set beside his plate, as though it might attempt to escape. He ate with the focused speed of a man who regards meals as inefficiencies imposed by biology. When Poirot mentioned, in a tone of idle curiosity, that he had been admiring the tower staircase that morning, Dr. Arslan looked up sharply. "You went up?" "Only part way. The dust discouraged me." Poirot smoothed his moustache. "It appears the staircase is not much used." "Fatma will not touch it," Dr. Arslan said with the particular contempt he reserved for irrationality. "I have been in the archive room twice and had to sweep my own path each time. The ISP woman is governed entirely by superstition. It is frankly obstructive." He stabbed a piece of bread. "Though I will say, and I say this as a man of science, that the acoustics of that staircase are genuinely peculiar. Stone of that age, those dimensions, certain wind conditions from the water. You can produce resonances that the uninformed might very easily mistake for." He stopped. "For a bell," Poirot suggested gently. Dr. Arslan looked at him with the expression of a man who has been manoeuvred into confirming something he would have preferred to dismiss. "Theoretically," he said, "in very specific meteorological conditions." "How interesting," said Poirot. "And last night the fog was quite particular, was it not?" The historian said nothing further and applied himself to his coffee with unnecessary concentration. Nadia Petrovna came down late and came down changed. The woman who had rattled her sherry glass at the dinner table had given way overnight to someone, quieter and more frightened, which was, Poirot reflected, a significant achievement given where she had started. She accepted tea from the silent maid and sat at the far end of the table near the window. Not because the view was pleasant, Poirot suspected, but because from that position she could see the tower without turning her head. She was watching it, even now. "Madame Petrovna," said Poirot conversationally, "you mentioned last evening that you had seen the figure 3 nights ago. You were quite certain of what you saw." "Quite certain," she said, without taking her eyes from the tower window. "I know what people think. That I am hysterical. That I imagine things." Her English was precise, with the slightly overstressed consonants of a person who had learned the language from a very correct teacher. "I am not imaginative, Monsieur Poirot. I was a school teacher for 30 years. I deal in facts." And the fact was a woman in white on the balcony, standing absolutely still. And then the bell. She pressed her lips together. "Afterwards I told Selim. He poured me brandy and talked about the legend for half an hour. It was not comforting." "And where was everyone else when you saw this figure?" She considered. "Dinner had ended perhaps an hour before. I was reading in my room. Ada had gone for a walk along the waterfront. I saw him from my window earlier. Dr. Arslan was still in the archive, I believe. Levant—" She paused. "Levant I did not see." Poirot thanked her gently and finished his coffee. He spent the remainder of the morning in agreeable conversation with Selim Demir, who showed him through the collection with proprietorial enthusiasm. Ottoman ceramics, Byzantine coins, a collection of illustrated manuscripts that had come from a monastery near Trabzon and were of genuine scholarly interest. Selim talked well and easily about his acquisitions. He talked about Kara Yali with the affectionate exasperation of a man attached to something that regularly caused him difficulty. He talked about Levant with the careful, measured pride of a father who has learned not to expect too much. He did not at any point raise the subject of why he had specifically wanted Hercule Poirot's company at Kara Yali. Poirot did not raise it either. He looked instead at the gap on the library shelf, 3 inches wide between 2 volumes of Ottoman administrative records, where something had been removed and not replaced. He looked at the way Selim's eyes moved twice to the tower window during their conversation. He looked at the small brass key on Selim's watch chain, worn smooth at the bow by frequent handling, which did not match any lock in the visible parts of the house. "You have a remarkable collection," said Poirot at the door of the library. "Remarkable and, I think, not yet complete." Selim smiled, but his hands were very still at his sides. That afternoon, Yusuf the boatman was mending a rope on the private landing stage when Poirot came to lean on the railing above him. They discussed, in a companionable way, the properties of the strait, the double current, the fog patterns, the behaviour of the water on certain nights when the wind came from the north and the surface turned the colour of pewter. "They say the current takes everything eventually," Yusuf offered without looking up from his rope. "Things put in the water here. They do not come back the way you expect. The deep current, it goes north, under the surface, against the top." He glanced up. "People do not always understand that there are 2 waters here, one that you see and one underneath, going the other way." Poirot looked out at the strait for a moment. "A most useful property," he said quietly, "for someone with something to conceal." Yusuf tied off his rope and said nothing, but his hands, Poirot noticed, had paused in their work for just a fraction longer than the thought required. That evening, before the household assembled for dinner, Poirot stood once more at the entrance to the tower staircase. The blue beads swayed faintly in a draught from under the door. He had identified 3 things that did not yet cohere into a pattern, and the absence of coherence irritated him, as only beautiful disorder can irritate a man who believes deeply in its opposite. He was still standing there when, from somewhere above, impossible to place, impossible to dismiss, the bell sounded again. This time it rang twice. Chapter 3. Something Wakes. The fog came in properly that evening. It had been threatening all day. A grey patience gathered on the northern horizon, advancing by degrees across the water. And by the time the household sat down to dinner, it had swallowed the opposite shore entirely, and was pressing close against the mansion's windows like something that wished to be admitted. The ships in the strait sounded their horns at intervals, low and mournful, and the sound travelled through the old walls in a way that made conversation feel intermittently pointless. Selim had ordered a rather good lamb, which no one ate with much appetite. The table that evening had the particular atmosphere of a gathering in which everyone is performing ease. Arda refilled glasses with gracious attentiveness. Dr. Arslan delivered a lengthy opinion on the Ottoman land registry system that no one had solicited. Selim laughed at things that were not quite funny. Levant, seated beside his father, cut his food into precise segments and ate them in a sequence that suggested his mind was engaged entirely elsewhere. Poirot ate his lamb, drank his wine in moderate quantity, and listened to what was not being said. It was Nadia who broke it. She had been sitting with her back very straight and her eyes moving between her plate and the window with increasing frequency. A woman engaged in a private argument between reason and instinct that instinct was winning by several lengths. Then, without prelude, she pushed back her chair and stood. Her face had gone quite white. "There," she said. The word came out flat, stripped of drama by sheer shock. She was looking at the tower window. "There, on the balcony." The table turned. Through the fog-thickened glass, visible in the way that pale things are visible in fog, not clearly, but with a certainty that clarity could not have improved, a figure stood on the tower balcony. White. Still. Its outline blurred by the fog and by something that was not quite the fog, a faint luminescence that separated it from the grey surrounding air as a candle flame separates itself from darkness. Then the bell rang. 3 times, each stroke distinct, resonant, arriving from somewhere above and inside the walls simultaneously, as though the stone itself were producing the sound rather than anything suspended within it. Arda was on his feet. Dr. Arslan rose more slowly, with the expression of a man attending an event he has publicly scorned and privately anticipated. Levant moved to the window without a word, his jaw set. Selim remained seated for a moment, just a moment, with his wineglass in his hand, staring at the tower with an expression that Poirot catalogued carefully. Not surprise, and not quite fear, but the recognizable face of a man watching something he had hoped would not happen. Then, from the courtyard below, the stone-flagged yard between the mansion's east wing and the tower base, where the old Byzantine foundations were exposed in a low wall along the water's edge. A scream. It was not Nadia who was standing behind Poirot. and gripping the back of a dining chair. It came from outside, from the direction of the water, short and sharp, and ending abruptly in the particular way that sounds end when the person making them has stopped being able to make them. They found him on the rocks. Dr. Kemal Arslan lay at the base of the tower's outer wall, where the Byzantine stonework met the narrow shelf of rock above the waterline. He was on his back, one arm beneath him, his document case. That leather case he had carried everywhere, that he had set beside his breakfast plate as though it might escape. Lying open beside him, its contents partially dispersed by the wind. His neck was at an angle that required no medical training to interpret. Yusuf had heard the sound from the landing stage and come running. He stood back now, cap in hand, his face the colour of the fog. Poirot knelt beside the body. He noted the position of the limbs, the direction of the fall, the precise location relative to the balcony above. He noted the document case and the scattered papers, and the fact that 2 sheets had already been carried by the wind to the water's edge and were darkening at their corners with absorbed moisture. He noted that the rock surface immediately around the body was disturbed. Foot scuffed in a way that suggested more than one person's recent passage, and then he noted something else. Close to where the tower wall met the rock, in a shallow concavity where the evening's damp had left a thin skin of wet sand and salt deposit, there was a footprint. A single, clear impression of the ball and toes of a shoe with a rubber sole. The kind of practical, silent sole one found on deck shoes, or certain varieties of indoor slipper. It was oriented toward the tower wall rather than away from it. Not someone fleeing the scene. Someone who had been standing very close to the wall, looking up, or waiting. Poirot rose and moved swiftly to the tower staircase entrance, ducking beneath the blue glass beads without ceremony. He took the stairs quickly, his hand on the wall. Near the base in the cleared strip he had examined that morning, he stopped and angled his pocket torch downward. There, along the right-hand wall at the height a person might steady themselves in haste. A smear. Not dust, not the ordinary grime of old stone. A faint transfer of something powdery, faintly iridescent in the torch beam. Not enough to be seen without looking for it. The kind of trace left by clothing that had been treated, or fabric that had been prepared. Phosphorescent. Poirot touched it with one gloved fingertip and examined the result with close attention for several seconds. Then he descended, very thoughtfully, back to the courtyard. The household had assembled around the body in the instinctive cluster of people who do not know what else to do with themselves. Nadia was shaking in a sustained, involuntary way that had gone past distress into something more mechanical. Selim had his hand on her arm and was speaking to her in a low, continuous voice that appeared to comfort neither of them. Levant stood apart, looking not at the body, but at the tower balcony above it, with an expression of concentrated, private fury that Poirot noted and set aside for examination. Ada was the one who spoke first, and practically, "We must telephone for the police, and a doctor, though." He did not complete the thought. The condition of Dr. Arslan rendered it unnecessary. "The telephone," said Selim, surfacing from his shock, "is in the study." "I know where it is," said Ada, and went inside. Poirot remained in the courtyard a few minutes longer. The fog had, if anything, thickened. The figure on the tower balcony was gone, had been gone since before they reached the body. The balcony was empty and dark. From the water came the low groan of a tanker making the southern passage, invisible in the fog, its horn expressing what the circumstances seemed to require. He moved to the low Byzantine wall at the yard's edge and looked down at the narrow shingle where the waves retreated. The footprint in the wet sand had been made within the last hour. Its edges were still crisp, unfilled by the tide, rubber-soled, oriented inward, and beside it, half embedded in the shingle where a wave had deposited it and retreated, something small and bright. He picked it up with a handkerchief, a button, white, slightly convex with 4 holes, the kind used on a certain variety of light summer jacket or on theatrical costuming of the simpler sort. Not tarnished, not long in the water. Poirot wrapped it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. When he returned inside, Ada was just replacing the telephone receiver. "The police will come by boat in the morning," he reported. "The fog makes the road impassable tonight. There is a gendarme post at the village." "In the morning," Selim repeated. He sat down heavily in the hall chair. "Then we are here tonight, all of us." "Yes," said Poirot quietly. "All of us." He looked around the faces assembled in the hallway, the genuine terror on Nadia's, the rigid self-containment of Levent's, the dull shock of Selim's. And finally, at Ada, who was standing by the study door with his arms folded, his expression composed and appropriately grave, in the manner of a man who is very good at knowing what expression a situation requires. "One thing puzzles me," Poirot said, in a tone of gentle inconsequentiality. "Dr. Arslan was, I think, a methodical man. He kept his document case with him at all times. And yet, this evening at dinner, I noticed he had left it behind. It was on the sideboard rather than beside his chair." He paused. What could have caused him to leave the table so quickly, and without it, that he did not think to take it? The hallway was very quiet beneath the horns of the invisible ships. "Perhaps," said Ada after a moment, "he saw something." "Perhaps," said Poirot, "he saw someone." No one answered. The fog pressed close against the windows, and somewhere above them, in the old Byzantine stones, the cold air moved without wind and was still. Chapter 4. Fear Spreads. The night that followed was not a restful one for anyone at Yali, with the possible exception of Poirot, who had trained himself over many decades to sleep soundly in the presence of unsolved problems, on the reasonable grounds that exhaustion served neither the grey cells nor the moustache. He was awake by 6 nonetheless. From the corridor outside his room, he could hear Fatma moving between the kitchen and the hall with the heavy purposefulness of a woman preparing for a siege. The smell of strong coffee reached him before he had finished dressing. By the time he descended, 2 of the underservants had not appeared at all, their pallets in the back quarters abandoned, their few possessions gone with them. Fatma mentioned this with the compressed fury of a woman who considers desertion a personal insult and the supernatural a wholly inadequate excuse for it. "They were village girls," she said, setting Poirot's coffee before him with rather more force than was strictly necessary. "They have mothers who fill their heads with nonsense. The bride, the bell, the old stories." She crossed herself, an Ottoman Christian habit, old as the Byzantine stones beneath them, and added with rather less certainty than her tone implied, "There is nothing in that tower." "I am sure you are right," said Poirot. "Tell me, Fatma Hanim, the document case that Dr. Arslan carried. Did you see it last night before dinner? Was it in his room, or had he taken it elsewhere?" She considered this with the thorough attention she gave to practical questions, as distinct from supernatural ones. I took clean towels to his room at 6:30. The case was on his writing table. Closed. And his room is on which side of the house? East wing, above the archive. Above the archive, Poirot repeated pleasantly. Thank you. He drank his coffee, which was excellent, Fatma's one unambiguous gift to the household, and thought about the geography of the East Wing for some time. The police arrived mid-morning by a small motor launch that came through the thinning fog with a self-important urgency somewhat undermined by the difficulty its pilot experienced in locating the landing stage. There were two of them, a senior officer named Zorlu, a compact man of 50 with a grey moustache considerably inferior to Poirot's own, and the mildly harassed expression of someone whose jurisdiction had not previously included distinguished foreign visitors or apparent hauntings, and a younger constable who wrote everything down in a notebook and said nothing. Zorlu regarded the body, regarded the tower, regarded Poirot, and then regarded the assembled household with the weary pragmatism of a man who has learned that the truth of any situation is usually simpler than its participants wish it to be. A fall, he said. So it appears, said Poirot, from the balcony. That would be the natural inference from the position of the body, yes. Zorlu looked at him. You have a different inference, Monsieur Poirot. I have several questions, Poirot said mildly, which is not quite the same thing, but generally leads to the same place, given sufficient time. The inspector's moustache twitched. He had heard of Hercule Poirot, who, in his profession, had not, and he appeared to be recalibrating his morning accordingly. He interviewed each member of the household in the drawing room while the constable wrote, and Poirot, who had not been invited to sit in, stood in the corridor outside the door, with every appearance of a man contemplating the middle distance, and heard everything perfectly well through the gap in the door frame that the warped wood of Kara Yali produced as a matter of structural routine. The accounts were consistent in their broad outline and illuminating in their small divergences. Everyone had been at dinner when Nadia saw the figure. Everyone had gone to the window. Everyone had heard the bell, though Levent, notably, described it as a sound like a bell, rather than a bell itself, a distinction that the constable's pencil faithfully recorded without anyone present appearing to notice its significance. Where the accounts diverged was in the 10 minutes before dinner. Ada had been, he said, in his room writing letters. Selim had been with him. They had been discussing a transaction briefly in the corridor outside Ada's door. Levent had been on the waterfront, walking. Nadia had been in her room. None of them had seen Dr. Arslan after he left the afternoon's work in the archive at approximately 5 o'clock. None of them could account for what had drawn him to the tower. Poirot found Levant on the landing stage after the interviews concluded, sitting on the mooring post with his hands between his knees and his eyes on the water. He was 25, Poirot reminded himself, and had spent last night in a house where a man had died, and the police had come, and his father had said very little that was useful to anyone. He looked younger than 25 this morning. The archive, Poirot said without preliminary. You have been in it? Levant did not seem surprised by the question. Once or twice, when I was a boy, my father used to show me things, old maps, correspondence. He liked to explain the history. And recently? A pause. The water moved against the landing stage with small, insistent sounds. Dr. Arslan kept it locked. He had the key. Your father gave him the key. My father, said Levant with careful neutrality, gives people things before he understands what they intend to do with them. He picked up a small stone from the planking and dropped it into the water. That is not a criticism, it is a description. Poirot sat down on the adjacent post with a disregard for his trouser crease that he would not have permitted under less instructive circumstances. And Arda Caraca. Your father gave him access also. Arda has been here 3 months. He has been in every room in this house. Levent said it without rancour, which was, Poirot reflected, considerably more disturbing than if he had said it with some. He is very interested in the family history. He asks questions, good questions, knowledgeable questions, about the Demir line, the property records, the old transactions. My father is flattered. My father is always flattered by interest in the collection. And you are not flattered. Levent looked at him directly for the first time. I think there is a difference between interest in a collection and interest in what the collection proves. Dr. Arslan understood that difference. He told me so 2 weeks ago. He said he had found something in the archive that would... He stopped. Yes, said Poirot with great gentleness. He said it would complicate things considerably. Levent turned back to the water. He was going to speak to my father. He seemed not alarmed exactly, more as if he was deciding how to handle something that required care. Did he tell you what he had found? No. I assumed it was something to do with the provenance of a piece in the collection. A disputed ownership, perhaps. It happens. He paused. Now I think it was something else entirely. Poirot rose from the mooring post, attending to his trouser crease. One further question. This walk you took yesterday evening before dinner, along the waterfront. You were outside when, precisely? From about 6:30 until the dinner bell. Perhaps 40 minutes. And the tower, you would have passed it. I always pass it. Did you see anything? Levent was quiet for a moment that was a fraction longer than a simple negative required. I saw a light, he said at last. In the tower through one of the slit windows. Very brief. I thought it was a reflection from the water. He looked at Poirot. I did not think much of it at the time. I think a great deal of it now. Poirot thanked him and walked back toward the house along the base of the tower wall, moving slowly, his eyes on the ground. The tide had come in during the night and retreated, smoothing the shingle. The footprint was gone. The area around the base of the wall had been washed and rearranged by the water with great efficiency, as though the Bosphorus had decided to be helpful. Or instructed. He stood at the spot where he had found the button and looked up at the tower balcony above him, measuring distances with his eye. Then he looked at the wall surface itself, at the junction of Ottoman brick and Byzantine stone, and at the faint series of marks, scrapes really, barely distinguishable from the general weathering, that ran vertically from approximately 6 feet above the ground to a point just below the balcony's underside. A rope. Or something very like one, not used to go up. The angle was wrong for that. Used rather to lower something from the balcony to the ground with reasonable speed and absolute silence. Inside, Poirot could hear Nadia Petrovna in the drawing room, telling Fatma in a mixture of Russian and approximate Turkish that the bride had returned, that the house was cursed, that she intended to leave on the first available boat. Fatma was responding from the sound of it with the kind of pragmatic sympathy that stops just short of agreement. And from Selim's study, just audible through the closed door, came the sound of a drawer being opened, and then locked, and then the particular silence of a man sitting very still with something on his conscience. Poirot straightened his cuffs and went in to find him. Chapter 5. In the dark, We show our true faces. Selim Demir's study was a room that had accumulated its owner's character the way certain coastlines accumulate debris, not by design, but by the steady deposit of years. Books occupied every horizontal surface. Correspondence lay in drifts across the desk. On the windowsill, 3 Byzantine coins sat in a row beside an empty brandy glass, and the brandy glass was not, from its position, a recent arrival. Selim himself was in the chair behind the desk, and he had the look of a man who had been conducting a long and unproductive argument with himself. When Poirot entered, the door had not been properly latched. It swung inward at the lightest touch. He looked up with the expression of someone who is relieved and apprehensive in equal measure. "I expected you earlier," he said. "I had other conversations first," said Poirot, closing the door behind him. "They were instructive. Yours, I think, will be more so." Selim looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who handled delicate things for a living, careful, fine-boned, and they lay open on the desk in the attitude of surrender. "You know about the document," he said at last. "I know there is one," said Poirot, settling himself in the visitor's chair with the composure of a man who has just had a reasonable hypothesis confirmed. "Tell me about it." What emerged over the following half-hour was, like most confessions, a mixture of the deliberately withheld and the genuinely shameful, delivered in the order that caused its speaker the least discomfort rather than the order that would have been most useful to his listener. Poirot listened without interruption, rearranging the sequence internally as it arrived. The essential facts were these. 3 weeks before Poirot's arrival, Dr. Arslan had located in the deepest portion of the archive a collection of documents that had been placed there deliberately, carefully, behind a false panel in the lower shelving, sometime in the mid-19th century. They were administrative records of the Ottoman period, property transfers, legal instruments, a document of formal acknowledgement bearing the seals of 2 families. Together, they constituted, Dr. Arslan had concluded, evidence that the Demir family's title to Kara Yali was not, and had never been, entirely clean. The property had passed to Selim's great-great-grandfather through the suppression of a competing claim, a claim arising from a child, the child of Leyla Halide. "She was pregnant when she died," Selim said. His voice had the quality of a man reciting something he has read too many times to feel any more. "The child was given to a family in the city. The records were hidden. The Demir name was the only one that appeared in any subsequent documentation." He paused. Arslan said the inheritance claim was almost certainly not actionable under current law. Too much time, too many subsequent transactions. But the moral weight of it, he pressed his lips together. He said someone should be told. "And who had he told?" Poirot asked. Selim was quiet for a moment. "He had told me he intended to speak with me formally, to show me the documents. He wanted to do it properly, he said. To lay everything out in order, the evidence, the genealogy, the legal position. He was a precise man." A pause in which something shifted in Selim's expression. Grief, perhaps, arriving a day late to make itself known. He never got the chance. "The documents," said Poirot. "They are still in the archive." Selim opened the locked drawer and withdrew a manila envelope, slightly worn at the corners. "He gave me copies, for safekeeping," he said. "The originals remain in the archive, or they did. I have not been in since." Poirot took the envelope, did not open it, and set it on his knee. "And the competing claim, the child, the bloodline. Dr. Arslan traced it?" He said he had done preliminary work, that the line continued, that there was, in fact, a living descendant. Selim looked out the window towards the water. He had not yet told me who. The storm arrived that afternoon with the conviction of something that had been planning its entrance since morning. The electricity failed twice before dinner and abandoned the effort entirely by 7 o'clock, leaving the household to manage with oil lamps and candles in an arrangement that was atmospheric in a way no one present was disposed to appreciate. The fog had not lifted. Rain now added itself to it, driving hard against the western windows, and finding, with unerring instinct, every gap in Yali's ancient glazing. Poirot conducted the evening by candlelight. He moved between rooms with the unhurried patience of a man who finds other people's discomfort professionally useful. In the drawing room, Nadia sat close to a lamp with a book she was not reading. In the dining room, Ada had produced a deck of cards and was performing a solitaire with the focused nonchalance of a man who has decided that studied calm is his best available posture. Levent was not in any of the main rooms. Fatma, when asked, said he had taken a lamp to the east wing passage and had not returned. Poirot found him outside the archive door. The archive occupied a low-ceilinged room at the end of the east wing, its single window facing the courtyard and the tower beyond. The door was locked. Levent was standing before it, with a lamp in one hand and a key in the other, the key that Dr. Arslan had carried on, his person, and that had been returned with his other effects that morning by Inspector Zorlu, who had taken it, examined it, and deemed it unremarkable. "You took it from the inspector's table," Poirot said without accusation. "He left it there," said Levent. "He did not consider it significant." He looked at the key, then at the door, then at Poirot. "I want to see what Arslan found before someone else does." "Before Ada does," Poirot said. Levent did not deny it. "He has been asking about the archive for weeks. Small questions, patient questions, the kind that do not announce themselves as important until you have answered too many of them." He put the key in the lock. "Will you come in?" The archive was cold and smelled powerfully of old paper and cedar oil, with an undertone of the damp that permeated every room in Yali below the second floor. The shelves ran floor to ceiling, the older material at the base, the more recent administrative records above. At the far end, a small writing table held the tools of Dr. Arslan's cataloguing work. Numbered tags, a magnifying glass, and the cataloguing ledger itself, which lay open at a page approximately 2/3 through. Poirot brought his candle close. The last entry was dated 4 days previously. It recorded, in Dr. Arslan's compressed academic hand, the location and contents of the documents Selim had described. The property instruments, the legal record of the child, the transfer of custody. But below the final line of description, Arslan had written something in different ink, evidently added later, and more hastily. A name, a single name, underlined twice. Poirot read it. He straightened. He stood for a moment with the particular stillness he wore when a piece settled into its correct position, and the shape of the whole became, for the first time, fully visible. Then he closed the ledger and looked at Levent. "The lower shelves," he said. "The false panel. Show me." It took less time than Poirot had anticipated. The panel was simple, a length of shelving that pivoted on a central pin, releasing a shallow recess behind. The recess was empty. Not disturbed empty, not recently emptied with signs of haste. Cleanly empty, the wood at the back, free of the dust that coated every other interior surface as though it had been recently wiped, within the last 48 hours. Levant stared at it. The originals. Arslan told my father they were here. They were, said Poirot. They are not any longer. He ran his thumb along the wiped wood. Someone has been most thorough, most prompt. He turned to Levent. When Arda Karaka first came to Kara Yali, how did your father come to know him? Who made the introduction? Levent considered. He wrote a letter, introduced himself as a dealer. He knew a great deal about the collection already. Specific pieces, their provenance. My father was impressed. He paused. He had done his research. Yes, said Poirot softly. I imagine he had. A great deal of research, over a great many years. He tucked the ledger under his arm. We will take this, and you will say nothing of what we have found here tonight. Not to your father, not to anyone. He met Levent's eyes steadily. Especially not to Arda. They locked the archive behind them and parted in the East Wing corridor. Poirot returned to his room, set the ledger on the bedside table, and sat on the edge of the bed. The storm drove rain against his window. The candle flame bent in a draught from the old, imperfect walls. Somewhere below, the Bosphorus moved in its two directions simultaneously, the surface going one way, the deep current returning beneath it, secret and opposing. And the house leaned toward the water as it always had, patient as a question awaiting its answer. Poirot looked at the name in the ledger for a long time. Then he blew out the candle because the grey cells required darkness to work in, and worked. Chapter 6. The history, beneath the legend morning, brought a thin, exhausted sunshine that made no particular effort to warm anything, but at least had the decency to show up. The storm had passed in the small hours, leaving the courtyard stones dark with rain and the tower walls streaked with long, vertical stains, where water had forced itself through cracks that the summer had merely concealed. The Bosphorus was the colour of pewter, and across it the Asian shore emerged from the remnant mist with the cautious quality of something that had been away and was not entirely certain of its welcome. Poirot had slept 4 hours and felt, on balance, that this was adequate. He came down to find a white flower on the doorstep of the tower staircase. It was a small thing, a gardenia, its petals already beginning to brown at the edges in the manner of cut flowers that have been outside overnight. It had been placed there with some deliberateness, not dropped, not blown by the storm, but set squarely on the top step, with the stem pointing towards the door. Poirot regarded it for a moment, then stepped around it without touching it, and went to breakfast. Fatma, when asked, said there had been no flower there when she came down at 5. She said this with the flat certainty of a woman who notices the condition of every threshold in her domain as a matter of professional principle. She also said, unprompted, that this was the 3rd such flower in as many days, always placed at night, always a gardenia. "And you did not mention this before?" Poirot inquired pleasantly. Fatma regarded him with the expression of a woman who has learned, through considerable experience, that the things she considers significant and the things her employers consider significant occupy largely separate categories. "I mentioned it to Selim Bey," she said. "He said it was probably the garden boy leaving offerings. There is a superstition. Gardenias for the restless dead." She refilled his coffee. "I did not think the garden boy was here at 2 in the morning, but I have worked in this house for 19 years, and I have learned when to speak and when to be quiet." A most valuable education, said Poirot. Tell me, of the people in this house, who would know that particular superstition? The gardenia, the restless dead. Fatma thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. Any educated person from Istanbul. It is not obscure. A pause. But the garden boy does not know it. He is from Trabzon. He would use yellow chrysanthemums. Poirot thanked her with sincerity. He spent the morning in the library with the damp ledgers Selim had indicated on his first tour of the collection. The property and household records of Kara Yali, stretching back to the mansion's construction. Several volumes were missing from the run, their absence marked by the pale rectangles their spines had left on the shelf. These gaps, Poirot noted, corresponded precisely to the decades immediately following Leyla Halide's death. What remained was, nonetheless, instructive. The household accounts for the years following the tragedy recorded, with the meticulous dispassion of Ottoman administrative practice, a series of payments to a family in Beyoğlu, listed in the ledger simply as the K family, the initial alone, that continued on a quarterly basis for nearly 30 years before ceasing abruptly. There was no description of the payment's purpose. There did not need to be. Payments made quietly and consistently over 3 decades to an unnamed recipient, with no corresponding entry in the correspondence records. The grammar of concealment was, across all cultures and centuries, largely the same. The K family. Poirot sat back and considered the name underlined in Arslan's ledger. Karaka. In its older form beginning with K. He had, as a hypothesis, held this inference since the previous evening. Seeing it confirmed in faded ink in a household account more than a century old was a different matter from suspecting it. The grey cells did not, as a rule, permit themselves the luxury of satisfaction. There was always more architecture to test, more weight to apply to the structure before one could be confident it would bear. But they permitted themselves, on this occasion, a moment of recognition. He was still in the library when Arda Karaka appeared in the doorway. He had the air of a man who has decided to be direct and has dressed carefully for the occasion. His jacket was well pressed, his expression was open, candid, and had cost him some preparation. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "I think it is time you and I had an honest conversation." "I have been hoping for one," said Poirot. "Please sit down." Arda sat. He looked at the ledgers spread on the table and at Poirot's face, and read something in both that caused a brief recalibration behind his eyes, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough. "You've been doing your own research," he said. "I have been reading," said Poirot. "It is a less dramatic activity than some, but it has much to recommend it." He folded his hands. "You wish to be direct. Please proceed." What Arda offered was a version of directness that had been shaped, Poirot judged, with considerable care. He spoke of having discovered some years ago a family connection to Kara Yali. Through genealogical research, he said, conducted out of simple personal interest. He spoke of believing that certain historical records might exist that had bearing on his family's past. He acknowledged that he had come to the mansion under the pretext of business, that this had not been entirely honest, and that he regretted the deception. He did not mention Leyla Halide. He did not mention the hidden documents. He did not mention Dr. Arslan. He said all of this fluently, without hesitation, and with the precise quantity of remorse that a confession can carry, while still leaving most of its content intact. Poirot listened with every appearance of sympathetic attention. "And did you find what you were looking for?" he asked when Ada had finished. I found certain things, Ada said carefully. Enough to confirm what I suspected, that my family and the Demir family share a history that has not been properly acknowledged. He spread his hands. I want only recognition, not the property, not any legal claim, simply acknowledgement that the past occurred as it did. That is a most moderate ambition, said Poirot, for a man who has spent 3 months building it. Ada's smile arrived and remained in place with a slight additional effort. I am a patient person. You are, Poirot agreed. Patient and very well organized. The flowers, for instance. The gardenias. They are a thoughtful touch. They reinforce the atmosphere of the haunting very effectively, and they have the additional advantage of meaning something to anyone in Istanbul who knows the tradition, while meaning nothing at all to a visiting Belgian. He tilted his head. Though perhaps that was the point. One does not leave messages for people one expects to read them. One leaves them for people who will feel them. A silence fell between them. Outside, a ferry made its slow way southward, its horn momentarily filling the room. I am going to ask you a direct question, Poirot said. And I want you to understand that I ask it not as an accusation, but as a man who requires information in order to prevent further harm. Where were you between 6:30 and the dinner bell on the evening that Dr. Arslan died? Ada met his gaze. The candid expression held, but something behind it had become very still in the manner of water above a strong current. I told the inspector, he said. I was in my room, writing letters. Yes, said Poirot. You told the inspector that Selim was with you, briefly, in the corridor outside your room. And Selim told the inspector the same. 2 men who confirm each other's whereabouts at the relevant hour, he paused. I have found, in my experience, that such confirmations are sometimes the product of genuine proximity, and sometimes the product of a prior conversation about what it would be convenient to remember. Ada said nothing. He was, Poirot noted, a man with considerable self-command. The silence lasted precisely as long as it needed to, no longer. I think, said Ada at last quietly, that you have already decided what you believe happened. I have formed a view, Poirot said. I have not yet finished testing it. He rose and straightened his jacket. One more question, if you will permit. The documents that were stored behind the false panel in the archive, the originals, not the copies. If I were to ask you where they are now, what would you say? Ada looked at him for a long moment. Then he said with a simplicity that was either perfect honesty or its most accomplished imitation, I would say that a man who spent years tracing his family's stolen inheritance would be a very great fool to leave the evidence of it within reach of the family that stole it. He rose, nodded once with great courtesy, and left. Poirot remained in the library. He looked at the old quarterly payments in the household ledger, 30 years of guilt rendered in figures to the K family of Beyoğlu, and then at the gap on the shelf where the relevant volumes had been removed, and he thought about patience and planning, and what a person is willing to become in the service of a very old wrong. The tower staircase door was visible through the library window. As he watched, a draught moved the string of blue glass beads in a slow, pendulous arc. That evening, without announcement, a second white flower appeared. This one had been placed not at the tower door, but outside Nadia Petrovna's room. And beneath it, written on a strip of paper in a hand Poirot did not recognize, were 4 words in Turkish that Fatma, summoned and pale, translated for him in a voice barely above a whisper. She says, "The sea remembers." Poirot looked at the paper. Then he looked at the door to Nadia's room, and at the strip of light visible beneath it, and at the shadow moving within. A woman pacing, 5 steps one way and 5 steps back, as she had, he suspected, been doing since the flower was found. Someone wished very badly to be believed in. The question that occupied Poirot as he returned to his room was not whether the haunting was artificial, he had known that since the first night, but rather which of its elements had been designed for the household at large, and which, very specifically, had been designed for him. Chapter 7. The Ghost Unmasked. The second supernatural event occurred at 20 minutes past 10 on the following evening, and Poirot was ready for it. He had spent the intervening day in a manner that must have appeared to casual observation entirely unproductive. He walked the shoreline twice in the weak afternoon sun. He sat for an extended period on the landing stage, watching the tankers pass. He conversed with Yusuf about knots, their varieties, their properties, the specific uses of each, with the unhurried interest of a man with nothing particular to accomplish. He examined, on the pretext of admiring the view, the outer face of the tower from 3 different angles, and at 2 different times of day, noting how the light moved across the stonework, and how the fog, when it returned in the early evening, behaved against the balcony railing. He also spent 40 minutes alone in the tower itself, which he managed by the simple expedient of asking Fatma to unlock it for him on the grounds that he wished to assess the acoustics professionally. Fatma, who had by this point arrived at the conclusion that Monsieur Poirot was a man whose requests were best complied with and not examined, produced a key from the kitchen drawer and accompanied him to the door, where she stopped and declined, with great firmness, to go any further. He did not mind. He required only 20 minutes of the 40. What he found within the tower railing, the inner face of the wrought iron that ran along the balcony's edge, was not immediately visible. One had to look at the attachment points, small, drilled brackets, their metal slightly cleaner than the surrounding iron, the drill marks sharp-edged rather than weathered. Recent work. 4 brackets, evenly spaced, positioned at an angle that would allow whatever was attached to them to face outward and downward, toward the courtyard and the water below. Mirror panels, Poirot judged, from the angle and the spacing. Folding flat against the railing when not in use. Deployable in seconds. Designed to catch and amplify a light source positioned further back on the balcony, and project it forward into the fog as a diffuse, luminous shape. Not a clear image. Fog did not permit clarity, but an impression, a pale, glowing, unmistakable impression of a figure. He also found, wedged into a gap between the tower's inner wall and the stone floor of the balcony, a length of thin wire attached to a small, smooth-bored metal cylinder. The cylinder was the diameter of a wine bottle and perhaps 8 inches in length. Its bore was calibrated with the precision of a thing made to specification rather than improvised, and when Poirot held it to the wind that came off the Bosphorus, carefully at the angle the prevailing current suggested, it produced softly a tone, low, resonant, familiar. He set it back in its gap with some care and descended the tower stairs. That evening he took his position. He had arranged with Levent, the only member of the household in whom he had, for reasons both practical and temperamental, confided the outlines of his plan. That the young man would sit in the drawing-room and make note of any absences from the company. Poirot himself stationed himself in the library, whose window commanded a clear view of the tower door and the base of the staircase. He left the library lamp unlit and sat in the dark with his hands folded in his lap, and the patience of a man who has made an appointment and intends to keep it. At 10 past 10, Ada excused himself from the drawing room. Levant, when they compared notes later, confirmed that the excuse given was a headache. The timing, Poirot noted, was precise. Fog had come in heavily after dinner, the conditions identical to the night of Arslan's death. A man who had constructed a machine of atmosphere understood the necessity of matching its operating conditions. At 20 minutes past 10, the bell sounded. From the library window, Poirot watched the figure appear on the balcony. It was, in the fog, exactly what it was intended to be: pale, luminous, still, possessed of the particular quality of the uncanny that arises not from detail but from suggestion. The shape of a woman, the whiteness of a shroud, the glow of something that did not quite obey the normal behavior of light in fog. He watched it for the duration of 1 minute. He noted the precise angle of the light source, the slight mechanical tremor that ran through the figure when the wind shifted. A tremor no ghost would produce, but that fabric on a frame inevitably must. And the moment, 30 seconds in, when the figure appeared to shift position. Not drift, not move with supernatural grace. Shift as a person shifts their weight when a posture held too long becomes uncomfortable. Then he left the library and walked, at a pace he would have described as measured and anyone watching might have described as swift, to the tower door. He did not go up. Instead, he crossed to the courtyard wall and stood in the shadow of the Byzantine stonework, where the lamp above the tower door did not reach, and waited. The figure vanished from the balcony at 10:32. 3 minutes later, the tower door opened. Ada stepped out into the courtyard carrying a canvas bag that had not, to Poirot's recollection, been in evidence during dinner. He was wearing dark clothing and rubber-soled shoes, and the expression of a man completing a familiar task. He moved to the wall above the shingle, looked down at the water briefly, and then bent and lifted a loose stone in the Byzantine wall, one of the original courses, lower down where the restoration had not extended, and placed the canvas bag in the space beneath it. He replaced the stone. He straightened. He turned and found Hercule Poirot standing 4 feet away, regarding him with an expression of mild interest. Ada was, above all other things, a man of composure. The start was brief, a single involuntary compression of the jaw, before the composure reasserted itself. He looked at Poirot for a moment in silence. Then something in his face, some long-maintained surface tension, eased. "How long have you known?" he asked. He said it quietly, without resentment. "I have known the broad shape of it since your conversation in the library yesterday," Poirot said. "The precise mechanism, the brackets, the resonance tube, the rope arrangement. I confirmed this morning." He paused. "I have suspected who you were since the second day. Your name was the last confirmation, and it arrived, as such things do, in ink that was already a century old." Ada was quiet for a moment. Around them the fog pressed close, and the Bosphorus moved in the dark, below the wall, with its habitual indifference to human arrangements. "You're going to ask me about Arslan," he said at last. "I am going to ask you to tell me the truth about Arslan. There is a difference." Another silence. A ferry passed somewhere in the fog. Invisible, its hull lights diffused to a warm smear. "He found the documents before I was ready," Ada said. "I had been working toward a particular moment. A confrontation, properly staged, with everything in place. The documents, the genealogy, witnesses who could not easily dismiss what they were shown. I had planned it for months. A pause. Arslan was faster than I expected. He was going to tell Selim before I was prepared, before I had secured the originals. If Selim had the documents first, he could have destroyed them or disputed them or buried them again behind lawyers and time. I had spent 8 years. He stopped. I could not allow 8 years to be undone in an afternoon. And so you went to the tower, Poirot said. I went to the archive first. He was there. I had not intended. Ada's voice for the first time lost its steadiness. Not dramatically, the way a wall loses one stone quietly under sustained pressure. There was an argument. He had the documents in his hands. He would not give them to me. He said he had a scholarly obligation, a duty to Selim, that the truth belonged to the historical record and not to any individual's grievance. Something moved across his face. He called it a grievance. 8 years. My grandmother's name erased from every document. A child given away like a piece of furniture. The steadiness returned, colder now. He turned to leave. I took hold of his arm. He pulled away. He stumbled on the archive step. The door to the tower passage was open. Arslan had unlocked it himself earlier. I saw him do it from the corridor. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Poirot looked at him for a long moment. What he saw was not a simple thing. A man who had committed an act whose full enormity he had, perhaps not, in the moment, foreseen. A man who had then made the cold decision to use the machinery he had already constructed to conceal it. And beneath that, further down, a man who had come to this house carrying an injury so old it had calcified into certainty, and who had found, in the last possible moment, that the cost of justice was something he had not fully priced. "You will give me the canvas bag," Poirot said. Ada looked at the wall where the stone lay. Then he lifted it, took out the bag and held it out. Poirot took it. Inside, through the canvas, the rectangular firmness of documents, the originals safe and entire, and folded around them, carefully, a length of white fabric with a faint iridescent shimmer of phosphorescent paint applied to its surface. The ghost, at last, in one's hands. "Come inside," said Poirot. "There are things still to be said, and they are better said in the light." Ada followed him across the courtyard without resistance, and the fog closed behind them as though the conversation had not occurred at all. Chapter 8. The Emotional Earthquake. They sat in the drawing room. Poirot, Ada, and the long quiet that follows a man when he has said everything that can be said and is waiting to learn what will be done with it. Poirot had set the canvas bag on the low table between them and left it there, unopened, like a subject neither of them was yet addressing. The lamp on the side table gave the room a warmth the circumstances did not entirely merit. Outside, the fog continued its indifferent business against the windows. "You came here," Poirot said at last, "with a plan that was, in its essentials, rational. The haunting, it was not mere mischief, and it was not revenge. It was pressure. You wished to force the past into the present, to make Selim confront what his family had done in circumstances that made denial difficult." "I wanted witnesses," Ada said. His voice had settled into something level and stripped of its social performances. This, Poirot judged, was the man beneath the arriving and departing charm. Quieter, harder, more tired. A haunted house attracts attention. Guests come. Scholars come. Sooner or later, the right person would be present when the truth emerged. Someone whose account could not be dismissed as the complaint of an interested party. He looked at Poirot. When I learned you were to be Selim's guest, I thought, there it is. The right person. A man whose judgment no one disputes, whose presence lends weight to whatever he witnesses. And so certain elements of the haunting were arranged with me specifically in mind, Poirot said. The flowers outside Madame Petrovna's room, those were for the household, but the timing of the bell on my first night, the cold passage, those were for me. The tube carries sound as far as the upper corridor under the right conditions. I knew which room you had been given. Arda paused. I wanted you curious, not frightened. You are not, I think, a man who frightens easily. I am not, Poirot agreed without vanity, since it was simply true. But tell me, when you planned all this, when you constructed your apparatus and prepared your gardenias and calculated your fog conditions, at what point did Dr. Arslan enter the plan? He was not in the plan, Arda said flatly. He was in the archive. I had not anticipated that Selim would engage an independent historian. When I realized what Arslan was doing, that he was cataloguing the entire collection systematically, I understood he would find the panel. I had found it myself, 2 years earlier during a preliminary visit. I knew exactly what was behind it. And so you moved more quickly than you had intended. I needed the originals in my possession before he presented them to Selim. Once Selim held them, the moment was his to control, not mine. A pause waited with something that was not quite regret and not quite its absence. I went to speak with Arslan privately, to explain who I was, the full account, the genealogy, what the documents proved. I thought if he understood, he might give me time. A week, perhaps 2. His jaw tightened. He was not interested in giving me time. He was interested in academic procedure and his obligations to his commission. He said the documents would be presented to Selim that evening. And the archive step, Poirot said quietly. He turned quickly. The step is lower than it appears in that light. I had caught myself on it twice before. He went down hard, sideways. His head struck the doorframe of the tower passage. Arda looked at his hands. I went to him. He was breathing, but he was not conscious, and the angle of his neck. He stopped. I understood that what had happened could not be undone. And so you carried him to the tower. The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. Heavier, more inhabited. Arda did not deny it, did not embellish it, did not offer mitigating architecture. He simply held it. The balcony, said Poirot. The fall from the balcony completed what the step had begun, and gave it a location consistent with the haunting you had already established. A man who goes to investigate a ghostly apparition and falls from a tower. It is terrible, but it is explicable. It requires no further explanation. Yes, said Arda, a single syllable. The whole of it. Poirot was quiet for a moment. He thought of Dr. Arslan's breakfast table manner, the document case beside the plate, the spectacles pushed up on the forehead, the contempt for superstition that had been, he now understood, entirely genuine and entirely beside the point. A man of rigorous mind meeting his end on a low archive step in a dimly lit room because he had been inconveniently principled at an inconvenient moment. I will tell you what I am going to do, Poirot said. And then I will tell you what you are going to do. And then, if you are a man of any remaining sense, you will do it. Arda waited. In the morning, I will ask Selim to assemble the household. I will present the documents, both the originals and the copies. And I will give a full account of what those documents establish. The history of Leyla Halide, the child, the payments to your family, the suppression of the bloodline. All of it will be said clearly in front of witnesses. Your claim, the moral claim, which is the only one time has left you, will be acknowledged. And Arslan, Poirot said, will require the police. That is not in my power to alter, and I would not alter it if it were. What I can do, what the truth of the evening permits, is present the full account as you have given it to me, which contains, as I am sure you know, a distinction between what you intended and what occurred. Ada looked at him with the expression of a man who has been offered something and is deciding whether the price printed on it is the price being charged. You believe me, he said, about the step. I believe the architecture of the events is consistent with what you describe, Poirot said carefully. An argument, a fall, a door frame. There is nothing in the physical evidence that contradicts it. There is also nothing that conclusively confirms it. A jury, in time, will reach its own conclusion. He paused. I am not a jury. I am a man who is telling you what the truth is worth and what concealment costs. The concealment, the tower, the continued haunting, the removal of the originals, that is not consistent with a man who acted in panic and then stopped. That is a man who made choices, calmly, over several days. The jury will weigh that. Ada absorbed this without expression. Then, slowly, he nodded. They sat a while longer without speaking. Somewhere in the house a door opened and closed. Levent, returning to his room, or Fatma making her last rounds before bed. The ordinary sounds of a household that did not yet know what morning would bring. 8 years, Poirot said, not unkindly. It is a long time to carry something. My grandmother was 74 when she died, Ada said. She never spoke of it directly, but she kept a photograph of the Bosphorus on her wall. Just the water, no landmarks. And when I asked her once what it was, she said it was a place that had forgotten her name. I was 11. He was quiet for a moment. I did not understand it then. I spent 8 years making sure I understood it. Poirot looked at the canvas bag on the table. The documents within it represented the end of a very long chain of consequence. A young woman on a tower balcony 2 centuries ago, a child given away, a name removed from the record, a family that kept a photograph of water on the wall because there was nothing else left to keep. He thought about what Ada had built from that inheritance, the research, the patience, the elaborate theatre of it, and finally the irreversible act that had converted a plan for justice into something considerably more complicated. Go to your room, he said. Sleep if you are able. In the morning, say nothing until I have spoken. Ada rose. At the door he paused and turned back with a question that was not, Poirot judged, entirely rhetorical. Do you think she jumped, Leyla Halide, or was she pushed? Poirot considered this with the seriousness it deserved. I think, he said at last, that the truth of it died with the people who knew it, and that the legend grew precisely because a story that cannot be resolved will always find believers. He met Ada's gaze. What I think is that the answer would not change what happened to her, and it would not change what happened to Arslan. The past is a fixed thing, mon ami. It is only the present we can still affect. Ada looked at him for a long moment. Then he left. Poirot sat alone in the drawing room with the canvas bag and the lamp and the fog at the window, and allowed himself, for the space of several minutes, the considerable weight of what tomorrow required. Then he straightened his cuffs, aligned the canvas bag precisely with the edge of the table, and went to bed. Chapter 9. Daylight kills all ghosts. The morning that followed was the clearest since Poirot's arrival. The fog had withdrawn entirely overnight, leaving the Bosphorus exposed in flat, brilliant light. The water, a deep, moving blue, the tankers visible from shore to horizon, the Asian coastline sharp and present, in a way it had not been since he came. The tower cast an actual shadow across the courtyard, for the first time, a thing of precise geometry rather than Gothic suggestion. And in that shadow, the Byzantine stonework was simply old stone, requiring neither legend nor fear to account for it. Poirot noted this with satisfaction. He had always found that truth and good weather arrived, in his experience, with similar effect upon a house. He had spoken with Inspector Zorlu by telephone at 7 o'clock. Zorlu had listened to the broad outline with the attentive silence of a man revising his assessment of a situation he had believed concluded, and had said he would come by the morning launch with a colleague. He had also said, with the weary pragmatism Poirot had found in him before, that the presence of Hercule Poirot at any crime scene was either a great convenience or a great complication, and that experience had not yet permitted him to determine which. Poirot had found this entirely fair. At 9:30 he asked Fatma to bring the household to the drawing room. He had, since the previous night, opened every curtain in the room and added 2 additional lamps to the existing arrangement, so that the space was lit with an almost aggressive thoroughness. He had also, with Levent's assistance, carried in from the library the relevant ledgers and laid them open on the central table alongside the manila envelope of copies and the canvas bag. The documents, originals and reproductions together, were arranged in the sequence they would be needed, with the precision of a man setting out the materials for a demonstration. He had learned over many years that the manner in which a room was prepared for a revelation was not a trivial matter. Dark rooms encouraged the suspension of disbelief. Lit ones required facts to stand on their own. They came in by degrees. Selim first, noting the open ledgers with the expression of a man who has been awaiting an operation and is relieved, at last, to be on the table. Nadia next, wrapped in a shawl despite the morning's warmth, who looked at the canvas bag and then looked away. Levent stood near the window, where the light was strongest, as though he had positioned himself there deliberately. Fatma appeared in the doorway and was waved in by Poirot with a gesture that brooked no argument. She had been in this house 19 years and had earned what was about to be said. Arda came last. He sat in the chair furthest from the table, his hands resting on his knees, and looked at no one in particular. He had the contained stillness of a man who has made his peace with the immediate future and is conserving himself for what lies beyond it. Poirot remained standing. He began, as Christie's method had always demanded of him, not with the conclusion, but with the ground. He spoke of Leyla Halide clearly, and without embellishment. The tower, the sailor, the father, the morning they found her at the foot of the rocks. He spoke of the child, a daughter, the documents indicated, given to a family in Beyoğlu under arrangements that the Demir household accounts recorded in quarterly payments for 3 decades, payments that stopped only when the family receiving them could no longer be traced. He set the relevant ledger pages before the table and invited those present to read them, which Selim did with the slow, unwilling attention of a man reading his own sentence. The legend of the Bride of the Bosphorus, Poirot continued, has persisted for 2 centuries not because it is supernatural, but because it is true. Leyla Halide was murdered. The legend was shaped over years and generations to protect the name of those responsible. Ghost stories are, in this respect, most useful. They preserve the emotional truth of an event while obscuring every fact that might lead to accountability. He paused and looked around the room. But legends have a second property that their inventors do not always anticipate. They persist, and the people they describe persist. Or rather, their bloodlines do. The child of Leyla Halide did not disappear. She grew up, married, had children of her own, and in time one of those children, a young man with considerable patience and considerable intelligence, came to understand what his family had lost and determined to recover it. He did not look at Ada. He did not need to. He could hear, in the quality of the silence, every person in the room performing the same arithmetic. He then dismantled the haunting, piece by piece, with the methodical satisfaction of a craftsman reversing another craftsman's work. The mirror brackets on the balcony railing angled to project light forward into fog. The resonance tube wedged in the tower stones, calibrated to the prevailing wind direction off the Bosphorus. The phosphorescent fabric on a frame, deployed from the balcony and retrieved by rope in under 2 minutes. The chemical preparation used to write on Nadia's fogged mirror. A glycerin compound available from any apothecary, applied to the glass hours in advance, becoming visible only when breath or warm air raised the surface temperature. The gardenias placed at calculated intervals to maintain and refresh the atmosphere of dread. A ghost, Poirot said, requires 3 things to be believed. It requires darkness because darkness prevents examination. It requires an audience already disposed towards belief, because such an audience supplies the details that the ghost itself cannot provide. And it requires a storyteller, someone to keep the legend vivid and present in the minds of those who will witness it. He turned to Ada now, directly. You were all 3 at once, the architect, the audience preparer, and the narrator. It was, as a construction, of genuine brilliance. Ada said nothing. His expression remained composed, but something in it acknowledged what had been said. Selim made a sound that was not quite speech, a low, compressed exhalation, the sound of a man absorbing a blow he has known was coming, and has discovered hurts more upon arrival than anticipated. He looked at Ada with the particular anguish of a man reviewing 3 months of friendship through a corrective lens. "You sat at my table," he said at last, very quietly. "I sat at my family's table," Ada replied, with equal quietness and no aggression, or the nearest I could get to it. The room was very still. Nadia had begun to cry without any particular drama. The slow, continuous tears of someone releasing something held for several days under pressure, and was pressing a handkerchief to her face with both hands. Levent was looking at his father, and there was, in his expression, a complexity that Poirot read as the particular sorrow of a young man, discovering that the story of his family is larger and darker and less resolved than he had been permitted to know. Poirot set the original documents on the table. These belong, by any reasonable measure of justice, to Arda Caraca. They are the record of his family's existence and his family's claim. The legal question is for the courts, in time, if it comes to that. The moral question, he looked at Selim, is for you. He then named Arda plainly as the architect of Dr. Arslan's death, not with theatrical flourish, but with the same even cadence he had used for everything else, because truth delivered at a different pitch than the rest of the account draws attention to itself and invites the kind of doubt that theatricality always, ultimately, earns. He gave the account precisely as Arda had given it. The argument, the step, the door frame, the tower. He noted what the physical evidence confirmed and what it did not. He said clearly that the concealment that followed, the continued haunting, the removal of the documents, the careful maintenance of a false narrative, constituted a series of deliberate choices that the law would weigh on their own terms. "I do not tell you this to condemn," Poirot said, and he meant it, which was perhaps the most difficult thing in the room to say and to mean simultaneously. "I tell you because Arslan was a man of method and principle who died because he was inconveniently thorough, and he deserves to have the truth of his death spoken aloud by someone in a well-lit room." Fatma, in the doorway, crossed herself. When Inspector Zorlu arrived at 11 o'clock, Poirot met him at the landing stage and gave him the canvas bag, the ledger with Arslan's final entry, and a written summary of the previous evening's events. Zorlu read it standing on the dock in the good morning light, the Bosphorus moving behind him, and when he had finished he looked up and said only, "The man in the drawing room. He will come quietly." "He will come quietly," said Poirot. "He has had, I think, sufficient theatre for one season." Zorlu allowed himself a brief expression that stopped just short of a smile, folded the summary, and went in. Chapter 10. Morning Arda went with Zorlu's colleague by the police launch at 11:30. He carried nothing except the jacket he had worn to the drawing room and a small leather case that Fatma had packed for him with the wordless efficiency she applied to all tasks she found disagreeable. He did not look back at the house as the launch pulled away from the landing stage. He looked at the water and at the opposite shore, and at the sky above the strait, which was by now a very clear and ordinary blue. Poirot watched from the landing stage until the launch had passed the first bend and was no longer visible. Then he turned and walked back across the courtyard, past the tower, past the Byzantine wall with its replaced stone, and into the house. The drawing room had already been restored to its normal arrangement by Fatma, who considered disorder in any form a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be endured. The documents remained on the central table. Poirot had asked that they be left, and Selim was sitting before them with the expression of a man who has inherited something he did not ask for and does not yet know what to do with. He looked up when Poirot entered. "I keep reading the dates," he said. "The payments, 30 years. My great-great-grandfather sat in this house for 30 years, making those payments and never told anyone. Not his son. Not his son's son." He looked back at the ledger. "I wonder what he told himself." "People," said Poirot, sitting down across from him, "are very resourceful in the matter of telling themselves things. It is one of the less admirable properties of the human mind, but a reliable one. I should have known about the archive, about what was in it." Selim turned a page without reading it. "Arslan tried to tell me. He was finding his way toward it. You know, he mentioned a week before he died that certain holdings in the collection were more historically significant than their condition suggested. I thought he meant the manuscripts. I did not ask further questions because I was afraid of the answers. He closed the ledger. That is also a reliable property of the human mind, I imagine. The most reliable of all, Poirot said. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the two of them, while the Bosphorus went about its business outside and the tower cast its clean, unambiguous shadow across the courtyard stones. "What will you do?" Poirot asked. "With the documents, with the claim." Selim was quiet for a long time. "Acknowledge it," he said at last. "Formally, whatever legal form is appropriate. Ada is—" He stopped, reoriented. "Whatever he has done, the claim exists independently of him. It was true before he came here, and it will be true after." A pause. "Levent agrees. He was very clear about it this morning. Clearer than I was, in fact." "Your son," Poirot observed, "is a young man of considerable precision." "He is better than I deserve at present," Selim said without self-pity, which was the only mode in which the statement was endurable. Poirot left him there with the ledgers and went to find Nadia Petrovna, who had retreated after the morning's proceedings to the garden that ran along the mansion's southern wall. A garden that had been fighting a long, inconclusive battle with salt air and inattention, and was not losing exactly, but was not winning either. Nadia was sitting on a stone bench with her shawl around her and her tea growing cold beside her, looking at the water. "You are leaving?" she asked when he approached. "This afternoon. There is a ferry at 3. She nodded and was quiet for a moment. A gull passed overhead, considered the garden, and decided against it. "I feel rather foolish," she said at last. "You saw what you were meant to see," Poirot said. "In precisely the conditions it was designed to be seen in. The man who constructed it understood human perception with considerable sophistication. There is no particular foolishness in being deceived by a deception that was built specifically for you." "He knew I was frightened already," she said. "He knew I had told him in the first week, that I had come here partly because I found it comforting. The legend, the idea of her." She looked faintly embarrassed. "My husband died 2 years ago. I thought, a ghost who could not be laid to rest, who kept returning. There was something in it that I found less lonely than I should have." She picked up her tea, found it cold, and set it down again. "Which is absurd." "It is not absurd in the least," Poirot said with a gentleness that surprised neither of them. "It is entirely human. The legend of Leyla Halide has persisted for 2 centuries because human beings find it easier to live with a ghost than with a silence. A ghost implies continuity. It implies that what is lost does not simply stop." He paused. Ada understood this. He had lived with it himself in his own way. He simply made use of it, which was the part that was not kind. Nadia looked at him. "Was she real, do you think, in the beginning, before it was all machinery and mirrors? Was there ever anything in that tower?" Poirot considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "I think," he said, "that Leyla Halide was entirely real and entirely wronged, and that the legend which grew from her death was the only monument her family was permitted to leave her. Whether that monument acquired over 2 centuries any property beyond the human, that I cannot tell you." He met her gaze directly. "What I can tell you is that the bell I heard on my first night was a resonance tube, calibrated to the Bosphorus wind, and that the figure on the balcony was phosphorescent fabric on a frame, and that the cold in the upper corridor was a draught from a deliberately opened window in the tower passage." He paused. "And that none of that explains why, on my first night, I walked a little faster past the tower door. Nadia looked at him for a moment. Then, for the first time since Poirot had known her, she smiled, small, wry, entirely genuine. "That is the most comforting thing you could have said." "It is also," said Poirot, rising, "entirely true." He packed in the methodical sequence that 19 years of travel had rendered automatic. Suits folded on the diagonal, shoes wrapped, the ivory-handled comb in its case, the small travelling clock wound and positioned for transit. Georges, who had maintained throughout the week the philosophical equanimity of a valet who has attended his employer to stranger places than a haunted Ottoman waterfront mansion and expects he will again, brought the larger case up from the cellar storage and held it open with the expression of a man whose professional satisfaction is expressed entirely through the quality of his attention to luggage. Levant carried Poirot's cases to the landing stage at 2:30. They walked side by side through the courtyard, past the tower, and Levant paused for a moment at the base of the staircase and looked up at the balcony with the air of a man taking a measurement. "It looks smaller," he said. "Things generally do," said Poirot, "once you know how they work." The ferry was prompt, which Poirot took as a favourable indication regarding Istanbul in general. He stood at the stern rail as the boat pulled away from Kara Yali's landing stage and watched the mansion recede across the water. In the afternoon light, it was simply what it was: an old Ottoman waterside house leaning slightly toward the Bosphorus, its tower intact, its Byzantine foundations invisible beneath it, its windows catching the sun at angles that had nothing to do with the supernatural and everything to do with geometry. He turned and went inside to find a seat, because the wind off the water was making considerable inroads against his moustache, and there were limits. That evening in his Istanbul hotel, a room that was level, warm, free of sea damp, and equipped with a coffee service that operated on rational principles, Poirot restored order with the thoroughness the week required. Shoes aligned in their rack, suits hung and brushed, the moustache attended to with the full ceremony it had been denied at Kara Yali. The coffee, when it came, was precisely what coffee ought to be: hot, correctly filtered, served in a cup that did not tilt. He sat in the armchair by the window and looked out at Istanbul, which was conducting its evening business with the magnificent indifference of a city that has been doing so for 2,000 years, and considers the current century a relatively minor installment. He thought briefly of Ada and what awaited him: the slow machinery of the law, which would take what had happened on the archive step and decide what to make of it, as the law always did, with imperfect information and considerable confidence. He thought of Selim with his ledgers, and Nadia in her garden, and Levent carrying cases with the quiet competence of a young man who had decided to be reliable in a situation that had not rewarded reliability. He thought of Dr. Arslan, who had been inconveniently principled at the wrong moment, and had not had the opportunity to become less so. He thought, lastly and briefly, of the first night in the corridor. The cold with direction to it, the single bell tone, the faster pace past the tower door. He picked up his coffee. There was, of course, a perfectly adequate explanation for all of it: the resonance tube, the opened window, the acoustics of old Byzantine stone under specific meteorological conditions. Dr. Arslan himself had said as much before he died, and Dr. Arslan had been a man of rigorous mind. Poirot set down his coffee cup, aligned it precisely with its saucer, and looked out at the darkening city. Somewhere across the water, Kara Yali was settling into its evening. The tower stood where it had always stood. The Bosphorus moved in its two directions simultaneously, surface and depth, seen and unseen. The lights came on in the windows one by one, as they did in every house, in every city, at the end of every day. And somewhere in the old Byzantine stones beneath the mansion's foundations, in the joints between the masonry, in the hollow places where the wind found its way through from the water, something moved. The night was quite still. There was no wind at all.